I would like to introduce our chair for this evening, Dr. Hannah Hamad. Hannah, are you around? Hello. So Hannah is a reader in media and communications at Cardiff University, and she's going to introduce the rest of our panelists and take over from us. Over to you, Hannah.
Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you so much, Shelley. Thank you so much to the BAFTSS Horror SIG for arranging this evening's event and for making me welcome. I think it's my first time attending one of these weeknight bites, but I certainly hope it won't be the last. First things first, I'd like to introduce you to the other members of this evening's roundtable. We have a great lineup of participants this evening. We have Professor Melanie Williams from the University of East Anglia. Say hi, Mel.
Hello, hi.
And we have Dr. Johnny Walker from Northumbria University. There's Johnny.
Hello.
And last but not least, of course, we are here to celebrate the work of Kieran Foster, the author of Hammer Goes to Hell. There he is giving us a wave. I'm extremely pleased to be on this call tonight to chair our roundtable discussion celebrating the publication of Kieran's book on Unmade Hammer films, and it's genuinely such a pleasure to see his work on this subject matter come to fruition in the form of this new publication. I've heard quite a bit from Kieran about his research on this topic over the last few years, and I'm sure I'm not the only one on the call who has enjoyed hearing him give his talk on his Vampirella case study. I got to know him in the first instance online, though, during the era of Twitter before Elon Musk, at which time it was still just about possible to make some meaningful scholarly and personal connections with people in that way. We had a shared interest in the Unmade, although it's fair to say Kieran's is far more pronounced and far more central to his research profile than mine. And that being the case, I think I had actually been expecting to meet him in person at a conference focusing on the Unmade that was due to take place at De Montfort University in 2020. Obviously, that never took place, but I had already connected with him as he had been co-editing a collection on unmade films with James Fenwick and David Eldridge called Shadow Cinema, a publication that some of you might be familiar with, to which I had eventually, after running extremely late, contributed a chapter about unmade films about the so-called Yorkshire Ripper case in the early 1980s. The conference that was cancelled in the pandemic was duly reimagined by Kieran and his colleagues and relocated to Sheffield Hallam University in 2022. And Kieran and his co-organisers did me the incredible honour of inviting me to keynote that conference and to present the work that I had contributed to Shadow Cinema, whereupon I finally got the chance to meet him and to hear about the wonderful work that he was doing on Unmade Hammer films. And also just to experience in person the richness and the vibrancy of all the work presented at that conference, which really did such a great job of showcasing the extent to which work on the Unmade is becoming an increasingly exciting growth area for film studies and film history. So Kieran's book itself spans an impressive amount of history of Unmade Hammer, taking us from the formation of Hammer in the 1930s all the way up to the 21st century. And through the chapters, it takes us on a series of forensically carefully researched deep dives into a number of different case studies of Unmade Hammer, with an understandable focus on those of the post-war decades in the earlier chapters. But a significant intervention that Kieran's work makes is to expand the existing scope of study into Hammer by taking such a detailed look at the period through the 1980s, 1990s and beyond, during which time Hammer, of course, made no films at all. One thing that the book does lack, though, and Kieran, I hope you won't mind me saying this, is any citation whatsoever of the work of the great Taylor Swift. And just hear me out. There was a lot going on for all of us in 2020. I realise that. But I expect many of us will still remember when Taylor Swift unexpectedly dropped folklore upon us, including Kieran, who teased his potential future readers with his promise to include her lyric, "The greatest films of all time were never made," as an epigraph to open his book. I don't mind telling you that I promised him £100 of my own money if he went through with it. Well, I can tell you, I've now read every single page of Hammer Goes to Hell, and regrettably, Taylor Swift does not get one single mention. And I don't know what else to say except thank you, Kieran, for leaving me £100 richer for it. On to our main event for the evening, though, and myself, Melanie and Johnny are really looking forward to chatting with Kieran about his work in the book and about researching the Unmade in general. And that being the case, I know that each of us has some questions that we want to ask him to get the discussion going. And we will, of course, ensure that there's plenty of time to take questions for Kieran from everyone else later on in the session. All that being the case, Mel, can I turn to you to get us started with the first question for Kieran?
Yes, you can, Hannah. Thank you very much. And I suppose what I wanted to begin with is to reiterate what Hannah said about what I think Kieran's book brings to both the study of unmade, incomplete, partial films that have kind of been stuck in a kind of development hell, which of course the title of the book gestures towards. But it also gives us a kind of new take on a very well-trodden path within British cinema history. And I think that's, you know, a remarkable achievement. So I wanted to ask about the different case studies and where they came from. What might have been most kind of surprising about some of the case studies that you ended up working on, and anything you could kind of say about the archival research process, because this is clearly a project that's very grounded in original archival research.
Yeah, thanks, Mel. Thank you, Hannah. I forgot about the Taylor Swift thing. That's going to haunt me throughout this entire thing now. Like a Northerner's given up £100 willingly is absolutely, it's sacrilegious. Thanks everyone for coming. It's really nice to be here to talk about the book. On the question of the case studies, so yeah, there's two kind of ways to kind of frame it. There's trying to look at, the first one is logistics, like in terms of archival material and access. Obviously, as you say, the work is really focused on archival material and what is available. And that is obviously forms a huge part of any archival research. There is gaps, even in the book, in the case studies picked, there's gaps, there's drafts of scripts that are alluded to in interviews that are not available. And I looked, I did the research in, there was the Hammer Script Archive, which was based at De Montfort, where I was when I did this. And that was extensive in terms of the material held there, from scripts, correspondence, financial documentation. And then I did some work in the BBFC, which is mainly kind of material on censorship things. And that was extraordinarily useful, particularly for the early period. And then I got to go to LA, and the Margaret Herrick Library had some really fantastic stuff as well, particularly on that early period. So some of the case studies formed quite quickly through the amount of material. So like one of the projects is about the Loch Ness Monster movie, Nessie, which would have been Hammer's most expensive film if it was made. They put a big advert out in Variety kind of saying this is going to be a $7 million kind of huge blockbuster. And because it has that kind of weight to it, in terms of it has material published saying this is coming, there's like a cult following and fandom around it. But also, the archive had a massive file on it. Like the Nessie file was literally correspondence and financial documentation, which when I actually got my hands on it and sorted it and went through it in terms of the dates, told a pretty complete story, and a story that wasn't kind of particularly well known. So that was useful, and that kind of made that a no-brainer, as quick as a no-brainer could be in terms of focusing on it. It actually takes up, because that was the PhD piece, it ends up taking 2 chapters of the book because of that. things on the opposite side, Vampirella, which I did a kind of big project after the thesis and features quite heavily in the book, barely featured in the original work because we had a really fancy file on like the budget for hotels, and literally like the stationery budget was like £4.10, but we didn't have a script, so I could write about like, oh yeah, this is real, you know, here's the planning. They wanted Orson Welles, but he demanded going first class, and there was a bit of debate about that. I knew all that, but I didn't know what it was about. So I eventually got Hammer to send me a script, but this was too close to the actual Viva examination to include it. So I bottled it and didn't include it, and kind of came back to it as a postdoc project. So access played a big part on it, because Vampirella is just as big as Nessie in terms of like material available, promotional material about it. You know, Hammer promoted it significantly. They went to the famous Monsters Film Convention in 1975 to promote it. Big publicity kind of push towards it. And it featured, but not heavily in the thesis. And only when I actually got my hands on the script and material like that, did I kind of look to include it in the book. And you can see in the book, like, you know, for like Night Creatures, which is the I Am Legend adaptation, and that focuses on censorship because all I had was a script and a few kind of trade articles, but I had loads on the censorship material. So the case studies kind of formed through what was available in the archive and what was kind of significant in the trade presses and kind of fan magazines, contemporary fan magazines, kind of unmade films that had left an imprint or a mark on Hammer in some way, or Hammer kind of fans. But then the approach to those materials was often dictated by the archive and what was in them. You know, like Nessie is focused a lot on correspondence and financial documentation because there's loads of it. And Vlad the Impaler is mainly scripts because there's loads of it. So it's kind of like, again, what's in the archive and how to use it.
And do you think we get a kind of different version of Hammer, or a kind of alternative possible pathway, or a kind of an altogether, I don't know, different take on it through looking at the material that didn't make it to the screen?
I think so, because like 75 to 79, Hammer make 2 movies. Like that's a 4-year period of 2 movies. A studio that had been super prolific up until that point. And the 2 movies they make could not be grouped together coherently. It's The Lady Vanishes, kind of the Hitchcock remake, which is absolutely played more for kind of farce and a lighter tone. And then you have To the Devil a Daughter, which is kind of riffing off the kind of possession narratives, The Exorcist and Rosemary's Baby, and doing it quite effectively, but certainly, you know, there's no coherence between those 2 projects. But if you actually look at what's happening, you know, the reason there's only 2 projects, and if you just release a book on Hammer that is film by film by film by film, that there's no logic in that kind of collapse and thing. You can look at the kind of state of the industry, but it's because Hammer were busy trying to make other stuff. And the one thing I really try and get across is that Michael Carreras has many faults as a managing director. The company goes under him. But it's the fault and the kind of positive to him is that he's a creative, he's a director and a writer. And because he's a creative, he has a strategy that is quite creative, and Marcus Hearn calls it shit or bust, which is basically go big or go home, right? Just like think of a massive 4-quadrant project, spend loads of money on it, and if it's good, we'll get loads of money, and we'll be laughing, as opposed to kind of just small incremental films like American International Pictures did. So it's like that's their strategy, and by doing that strategy, there's loads of like Nessie and Vampirella and Vlad the Impaler are different. They're bigger in scale, they're bigger in ambition. I mean, Vlad the Impaler, Ken Russell is approached. There's lots of talk of who, you know, to try and get these kinds of new Hollywood directors involved. There's clearly they're not stagnant, but they're also kind of already cooked by that point for many reasons that we'll probably get into, that they're just not viable. So he's got this creative idea around them, which would absolutely have made a different Hammer. But it's whether or not they are hamstrung by external factors, or the fact that they might have a slate that is new Hammer, but they're very much old Hammer in charge of it, which is another thing I kind of maybe politely suggest in the book, that it's kind of still ran by the same dudes who were running it ages ago. So new slate, same people, kind of creates a bit of a tension, I think. But yeah, but they were cool, they were exciting, and they would have been new, but yeah.
Johnny, I hope you'll forgive me if I just butt in with a real quick follow-up to something that Kieran said by way of response to Mel's initial question. Kieran, I just wanted to pick up the thread of what you were talking about with regards to what drove your decision to make particular choices about which case studies to focus upon. I mean, there's an extent to which that you've answered my question already, up to a point in that it's clear that certain decisions were driven by sense of pragmatism about what was available in the archive that would enable a rich case study, and what wasn't. But at the same time, the way it comes across in the book itself is that you had an embarrassment of riches of potential directions to take your approach to historicizing and contextualizing the Unmade. Equally clear that you adopted and opted to take a case study approach. And that being the case, like, beyond the need to be pragmatic, which is like a need felt by anyone who studies the Unmade, were there any other things, any other rationales informing your choices and decisions about what Unmade projects you selected for particular scrutiny through the chapters?
Sure, yeah. So Night Creatures is kind of the first. So there's two I picked in the first chapter. The first chapter is a kind of looks at Tales of Frankenstein, which is a TV show, and it looks at Night Creatures. And the decision there is one, it's to take those two because most of the book is when Hammer are kind of up shit creek, really. They're struggling, they're fighting against a lot of issues. But those two projects come in like 58, 59, which is they just had like Frankenstein, Curse of Frankenstein, and there's this period where they basically have Dracula, which is absolutely a follow-up to Frankenstein. Be no-brainer. Okay, Frankenstein's been a hit. What Gothic text do we adapt next? Dracula is the clear step, to the point there is a fax in the BFI, which is literally James Curran sending a producer all of the receipts of Frankenstein, and then he just puts PS Dracula and a question mark, because it could be like, well, are we doing this? What's happening? But then they have Night Creatures in production, and Night Creatures is I Am Legend. And for some people who haven't seen it or read the book, there's the Will Smith adaptation that's super popular, but there's been adapted as The Last Man on Earth and things like that. Charlton Heston, but like that project is a contemporary set vampire story that has in the screenplay as well the novel Dracula read and kind of thrown away by the character in it as like rubbish and hokum, and they got Richard Matheson, the author of I Am Legend, to self-adapt it. So there's this period, it's basically a crossroads, right? Because that doesn't get made because the censors panic, because it's a grim script. It's not laugh a minute, even by today's standards. So they kind of say no to that. So there's this crossroads period of like Night Creatures, Dracula, and if one would have got made, or both would have got made, it might have been a totally different story, as opposed to this kind of fixation on Gothic in the early stages. So that was important for that reason. The TV show is important because it's a notable failure at a time they're being super successful. Like it just completely collapses from under them. And then the others, yeah, for example, Michael Carrera says that he managed to pick up loads of the money on Nessie. Like he said, I didn't really lose money on Nessie. There's an interview where he says he didn't lose money on Nessie, but Vampirella, which is a comic book adaptation, he says he lost a fortune on. So you go, okay, in terms of creative and financial labor, that is a project that is significant. If he's saying that has significantly damaged the fortunes of that company, and it's an unmade project that is barely mentioned in the actual histories of Hammer, and he's saying this is one of the things that absolutely knackered us, then it's worth exploring. And obviously Nessie, again, they kind of that, I guess, yeah, the hook is kind of the creative and financial labor aspect of it. How much work is going into these projects? Because there's some where they're open and shut, where you'll have a script, you'll read it, and then you'll find the facts where they'll be like, we're not doing that. That's not very good. And you're like, okay, mystery solved, I guess. You know, or like you'll see a treatment and they'll say, we're not going forward with that treatment. But there's many of them where through interviews and kind of accounts of at the time, in brilliant things like Little Shop of Horrors, the Dick Clemenson's long-running magazine, there's interviews with creatives saying this project is taking a long time, but we are going to do it. Vlad the Impaler starts in 74, still on the schedule in 2000. So, you know, the longevity and the creative and financial labor that's going into trying to make these was a big factor as well. And how that is apparent is through the material, you know, what he actually says about the money they're spending, but also through the interviews and accounts as well. And he was just trying to find but you're right, there is projects. I mean, there's a Victim of His Imagination, and then the book gets a brief mention, but that's had a revival in the 90s. It could have been a whole chapter on that. And it was just thinking and finding the kind of significance of them in terms of how long they maybe lasted, how much money was spent, how close they got to getting made, how much material was there. It was a very kind of, you know, by design of Unmade stuff, as you know, kind of messy methodological approach in terms of having to pull together what you know and making those decisions. But in some cases, the Hammer script archive at De Montfort is an embarrassment of riches, and in some there's limitations. You know, there's 2 Vampirella scripts, and I found this was an absolute kick in the teeth. I found an interview with Michael Curtis being like, "Yeah, there's like 17 Vampirella scripts." It's like, fuck, it took me so long to find 2. You know, like, it took me so long to get 2, and you're telling me there's 15 more of them. Absolutely stitched me up. But like, there's that kind of issue always. But yeah, there for the most part, it's that creative financial labor hook and finding as much about that you can. So yeah.
Yeah, so obviously archival absences is something that gets talked about a lot when we're talking about studying the Unmade. But as you point out, it can equally be the case that like a snowball effect with archival discovery can present an equal challenge. And circling back to the phrase that you used, messy methodology is something that I expect will come up again later in the discussion as we like broaden out.
Yeah, but there was 2 deliveries as well, I should mention. So there was the Hammer archive as I arrived in 2015. But then in like late 2016, there was a delivery of mid 2016, there was another delivery of materials. So just as I'm pulling together a literature review and structure, literally, and I think, you know, I think Steve Chin was on this call, so he might pull me up for hyperbole, but like, it was like a second archive just turned up. Like the Nessie file came with that second delivery. So again, a complete rethinking and what material becomes available added to the messiness for sure. Yeah.
Thank you, Kieran, and thank you, Johnny, for bearing with me while I jumped the queue. I'll hand over to you for your first question for Kieran now.
Excuse me. Thank you very much. I thought I was ready to speak and I had to clear my throat. Sorry about that. Yeah. So I mean, Kieran, you've touched a little bit about on this already, but the 70s fascinates me and probably interests me the most. Like when it comes to Hammer history, and you made the point about To the Devil a Daughter being the possession narrative that's attempting to ride the coattails of The Exorcist or Rosemary's Baby and whatnot. But you also make the point in the book that Nessie is framed internally, at least, as being a Jaws kind of movie. Yeah. So I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit about how Hammer is sort of navigating the new Hollywood, I suppose, or how is it's trying to sort of respond to these major changes in terms of, well, aesthetics, themes as well in films, but also audiences and in the wake of the blockbuster and so on. So if you could make some sense out of what I've just said, that would be.
I mean, that makes sense. That made sense, but I'm about to put it through an absolute maybe bullshit filter. So I'm sorry if I do, but yeah, I mean, I think it's like, so like there's a great, I think it's one of the subtitles of the book. Like there's a Michael Curtis who is coming across as maybe a tad pissed off about the fact that Vampirella has not worked. Star Wars has just come out and he says, well, Vampirella, we were ahead of the curve because we started Vampirella in 75 and that would have been like Star Wars, which it would not. Like that is, I'm happy to put my name to that quote. It would not have been like, Vampirella would not have been like Star Wars. But there is obviously, like with quotes like that, and with the fact like the Jaws connection with Nessie, it's in the script. There's a bit in the script where Nessie comes across a shark as big as Jaws. The merchandise people who did Jaws get in touch with Hammer. And these are deliberate, and it's framed internally, as you say, as that. And that idea of the kind of blockbuster, that kind of 4-quadrant hit, I think is the shit or bust thing. I think he's saying we need to make a project here that is massive in scope to appeal to loads of people. So what you see is they have an international cast for Nessie, right? So you have that, and Nessie, it's so cynical in a way, like because Nessie, spoiler alert, she escapes from Loch Ness. It'd be a very she immediately buggers off, and she's also radioactive, I should mention. And she's in the South China Sea, and she basically stops at places that Hammer have got funding deals with. So like she'll rock up to South Africa because in the script, because Hammer have made a deal with some South African financiers to give them some money towards Nessie, and there's that kind of element to it of that we need to appeal to big mass market films. I mean, and before they were focused on America, and they had a really good kind of transnational relationship with America. They see that they have to spread wider than America, and they absolutely are trying to go for those big blockbuster takes, and they're looking outside of horror. And one thing I argue in the book is they think they're looking outside of horror, but they keep falling back on what they know. They keep falling back on, let's have a bit of Dracula in the end of Umbrella, and we should mention, this will appeal. And maybe they think because that's sellable for them, but they absolutely do keep doing that. But with something like Nessie, they have big blockbuster ambitions, but it's not there. There's like a real big moment where they go to Columbia are panicking. They said they might give him some money. This big studio in the US, Columbia, say we might give you some money for Nessie, but we're not sure. So Michael Carreras sends them a reel of footage from Toho's movie and was like, any fears you have, this'll make you calm down. Sit, watch this, you'll feel better. And they watch it, and within minutes, they immediately say, we're out. It's terrible. That's not good enough effects-wise for us. Immediately bail on it. Like, there's a complete disconnect. He's not sent that tape like, oh no, they're going to see it and they're going to hate it. He's sent that willingly to thinking, this will be fine. This will be right. This will make the film much better with this. And it has the opposite effect. There is a disconnect between what he thinks these big blockbusters need and what they're happening. Like Parallels, Close Encounters of the Third Kind is on Columbia's list. That's being filmed at the time. So they understand what's happening around them. They change the appeal of these films to be bigger and to appeal wider. Even if they're gothic horrors like Vlad the Impaler, they're bigger and they're more ambitious. But they just do not have the actual function, I think, to actually be able to scale up, because we're not painting on that bigger canvas, I think. Yeah.
Can I chip in with something else? Is that okay? Well, so basically what you're saying is, and this does come across in the book, but for those who haven't read it, this is bad management ultimately. That's what we're talking about. But it strikes me that people who've got writing scripts for them at the time, like Christopher Wicking, for example, he is somebody who actually has his finger on the pulse in terms of what is going on elsewhere in film land.
I agree.
So can you is there anything to be said for the strain, sort of a strained relationship there between the sort of the new kids on the block who are coming in and trying to jazz things up script wise, and the senior management who are stuck in their old ways?
Yeah. Look, Chris Wicking tries to get a deal with Marvel. He has a meeting with Stan Lee to try and license the comic book characters, which is obviously, fingers very much on the pulse. And he has, the Little Shop of Horrors, which I've mentioned in the magazine, has a great thing of Chris Wicking's diaries, where he's kind of talking about trying to get these projects, and this has not worked. And it does come down to finances, and there's bad management for sure. But I really want to emphasize that Michael Carreras was completely stitched up by his dad. So he buys, he is stitched up. Arguing with myself, I don't even need a round table. I'll just cross-examine myself. Basically, James Carreras sees the writing on the wall. American finance pulls out basically of Britain, and the kind of Hammer's financial framework completely disappears. James Carreras sees that coming, who is the existing head of Hammer at the time, shrewd businessman, who, Freddie Francis, a filmmaker, says that James Carreras would be happy selling carpets. He's not a film lover. He doesn't care. He's just a really good businessman. And he sees that. He's like, right, I'm off. So he sells up Hammer, and he's looking at selling it to EMI. And Michael Carreras, who's been grown up with Hammer a long time, and in hindsight, he actually says this was a bit of a panicked move, gets a big loan and buys it off his dad, says, no, you're not selling it externally, I want it. So he sells it. And what he realizes when gets to the books is that James Carreras has been making deals with international financiers that basically say, you have all the rights to it, but we get a fee. So he has like nothing that he thinks he actually has. They're all tied up with the rights of the distributors and the co-producers. So the American finance model has collapsed, and he has been given this company that is not what he thought it was, and he's acted completely instinctively and stupidly. But he's ended up in this situation, I think emotional situation, where he's completely limited by the deal that he's got. And I think there is times in the book where you can probably feel me banging my head on the desk in terms of some of the decisions he's making around projects like Carly, Devil Bride of Dracula, which I guess maybe we'll get to later. And if I don't get to it later, feel free to ask me a question, anyone. Where he's interfering creatively because he's a director and writer. Suddenly he's a managing director, and James Carreras in that position was just kind of hands off. He knew the system, he knew kind of the material, he knew how to sell it, he knew how to pitch it. Michael Carreras is interfering in the creative process. He's changing scripts. He's active in the creative decisions, which slows everything down. So when New Kids on the Block, Chris Wicking, are hampered by being financially constrained to the point where they can't, deals, they're being told to write about things they don't even know deals are coming through. And then they have this creative element coming through as well. So I think the tension maybe isn't necessarily, it's not personal, you're bad at your job and I'm good at mine. It's the limitations on that company are so stifling at the time that I think it's pretty suffocating. So I think Chris Wicking has loads of cool ideas, loads of bonkers ideas. He's a big force at Hammer at the time, creative force, but he is still second to the managing and creative force of Michael Carreras. And that's where the tension is. Told you bullshit filter, didn't I?
Thank you, Kieran. Thank you, Johnny. Now, Mel, I did it to Johnny, and now I'm going to do it to you and jump the queue in reverse. Because, Kieran, I'm glad you brought up Carly, Devil Bride of Dracula, because one of the things that I found most fascinating about the research that's gone into this book are the instances that you talk about of cultural roadblocks, is the term you use in the book. Instances where projects were stymied by cultural roadblocks that proved obstructive to the ability of Hammer to make the films. Carly, Devil Bride of Dracula rises to prominence from among the examples that we could point to in the book. That being the case, can I ask you to elaborate for the attendees on some of these cultural roadblocks that stymied the projects?
Sure, yeah. So starting with Carly, Devil Bride of Dracula, right? So in 1972, Tony Hines, who had been a big producer at Hammer, he's quit earlier, but he's basically still working for him freelance. And he'd served in India in the war, and he writes a script called, at the time, Dracula, High Priest of Vampires, which is, for all intents and purposes, a Dracula in India story. And that is so Penny, the protagonist, goes to find her lost sister who's traveling in India and gets caught up in this fight between Dracula and the cult and his blood cult. That never goes anywhere. It's 1970, sorry, no. But then in 1974, this other project appears called Carly, Devil Bride of Dracula. And in a lot of kind of accounts of Hammer before, and I can completely see why you'd think this, and I think I'd probably make the same mistake without the material in front of me. It's a Dracula in India project. So it gets conflated as a draft of us coming from the same place, like a version of Tony Hines one. But it's not. It's completely different in a completely different context, because Hammer had this success with a film called Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires, which is Hong Kong action. Johnny's smiling there. It's an absolute banger for anyone who hasn't seen it. It's vampires mixed with kung fu. A co-production Hammer did with the Shaw Brothers, and it actually did all right. Like Warner Brothers were happy with it, and Warner's were like, okay, 1974, you've produced this. We have some rupees left in India. We've got loads of money we've made in India that because of government policy, it's frozen in India. We have to spend it there. So do what you did in Hong Kong with Dracula, but in India. So the first thing Michael Carrera does goes, oh, bro, I've got an India script already. Dust off Tony Hines' script. They say no, because it's too expensive. So he starts this new project. But the limitations and the cultural roadblocks, which is a term I worryingly do not remember using. So maybe I will have to read this book before the next decade. I was going to keep it. I was never going to read it again. The cultural roadblocks come through having to get approval by like Indian government officials. This is not just a co-production. This production, in terms of getting the rupees to make it, has to be signed off. And Don Houghton, who is a writer at Hammer, I mean, it's by no means is it culturally sensitive, but it's a script that is trying to be more. It features Kali, a Hindu goddess, but it actually features her as a kind of, you think she's the baddie, but then it turns out she's not. It's a complete manipulation by this human bad guy, and Kali actually ends up being a kind of force of good, a divine intervention at the end. And Don Horton's done that specifically because he knows it's going to have to be appeased, like, and make sense to Indian officials, Indian governments. And Michael Carreras, who's the head of the company, is like, Kali should be the baddie, and she should have sex with people, and she should murder people too. And there's Don Horton's fairly politely kind of says like, that's kind of like doing the same with the Virgin Mary, which is a quote. Actually, he actually does say that. And they have this creative kerfuffle, which is definitely not a term I use in the book. I know that for a fact. And it ends up with it doesn't get made because it's super time sensitive. By the time they finish arguing, the situation changes and the rupees are freed up. So Warner's just go, oh, we can just have our money now. And it's gone. So this kind of cultural roadblock comes from the fact that Michael Carrera cannot get his head around not being fully exploitation mode. Like they do Stranglers of Bombay, which is exploitation. And I just want to make for the record, Don Horton's script is by no means like it would not get made today. And it's by, it has Indian characters that are caricatures. It is broad. But there is parts of it. It's certainly, for example, it is way more nuanced in its approach to Kali than Indiana Jones Temple of Doom is 10 years later, right? Like it's much better than that, much more nuanced and much more approachable. I mean, in that film, literally, Kali is the devil. He says, see Kali in hell at the end. Indiana Jones does. But you can't get his head around it. Carrera's low bar. yeah, fair. It is. I mean, look, it's a low bar, but bless him, he jumps it. And I mean, Michael Carrera's, the bar's, I don't know where the bar is in terms of his approach to Kali, but it's a roadblock in the fact that he cannot get his head around, he cannot get out of that exploitation mode. He calls Kali a motivated mummy. He sees it as just another, he cannot get through his head this idea of the cultural sensitivities and balancing act. And maybe Don Horton's script wouldn't have done the job anyway. Maybe it would have still been beyond the pale. But he's the writer begging the managing director to see sense. So there's that kind of cultural roadblock, for sure. And there's cultural roadblocks in the way they are treating co-producers in Japan for Nessie. They are super disrespectful to Toho. Like throughout the script, Toho are just like, we're begging you, just send us something. And they just do not, and they cancel meetings with Toho to take other meetings, and they're stretched and they're financially and in terms of manpower limited. But Japan are doing the Toho, who did Godzilla movies, are signed on to do the effects for Nessie, and basically Hammer are like, oh yeah, so do Nessie. And they're working on it for years. And Hammer just do not treat them with any respect. Every demand that Toho makes to be more involved in the project, to offer more money. Hammer takes the money and creatively freezes them out of it consistently. And again, it slows the project down. This disrespect slows the project down. There's a huge miscommunication. It takes ages. Policies changed. Companies go. Tax write-offs become not write-offs, and it disappears. So these roadblocks, these insensitivities, these ignorances end up costing them because the finance situation changes. It's so finely balanced, and every time they absolutely fall, they somersault off, basically. So yeah, there's cultural roadblocks. I think is the most clear with Kali, but it's absolutely present in any kind of co-production that they're trying to do in the late 70s, I think.
Thank you so much, Kieran. I'll circle back to Mel now, who I know has another question for you. And thank you, Mel, for bearing with me while I jumped in.
No problem. Yes, I'm sort of interested in thinking about this comparatively as well, and whether you think that Hammer is kind of unique or is a particularly pronounced example of a company that had a kind of a problem with development and with unmade films, or whether the kinds of things that you're observing through your archival research are fairly typical. Are Hammer kind of unusual in this respect, or are they, you know, just one example of a much broader issue within the way that film production works?
I think they are not unique. I think they're unique in the sense of they have a studio brand, right? Like the Hammer horror is a thing, and it's a thing at the time. Certainly by the 70s. So you can take that idea of a studio brand, a studio known for something, and extrapolate from there those changes, and that's what makes it useful. But no, I mean, at the time in particular, the whole reason that films become unmade, as much as I've whinged about Michael Kors and things like that, the American finance collapses. There is Hammer have an over-reliance on American finance. They work with every major US production company going. They make films of lots, like all of them, and then basically there's this point in like 69, 70 where America, who is massively intertwined in the UK film production system, completely pulls out, disappears, and Hammer are just like, that's it. So there's no, that doesn't happen because of Hammer. That is a massive external production factor. So like that's, you know, and again, and when I talked about Nessie and Columbia did completely say, you know, panic when they looked at the footage, but they also had a huge scandal there that was completely unrelated to Hammer, which means all the board members changed. There is these external situations that are kind of working against Hammer. So because of the fact that these external things, you know, there is some unique Hammer stuff in terms of that father-son switch over managing director, they're moving towards a creative. There's unique problems. But the fact that finance just collapses, and the 70s cinema generally struggling in that early period, I think, well, late period as well, I think there will 100% be examples. Like, you know, I mean, I know you know, I had the Hammer script archive, I had the archive of a studio, and I'm sure if you look at other studios in that period, you would pull material. I mean, I've done work on other unmade stuff outside of Hammer, but kind of a lot of unmade stuff, work on unmade things is project to project. Right, so there's like an amazingly extensive book on Kubrick's Napoleon, for example, and there's obviously great work on Kubrick's Aryan Papers and Spielberg's Night Skies, and like projects take interest and become developed as great kind of works and papers and publications. But this is kind of the first studio study to go, okay, like let's have a look at this kind of continuous thread. But I'm sure there would be others. I mean, I know. Having De Montfort now has the Palace archive, and I'm sure, you know, there'd be unmade stuff there, and that would tell a story of a different era and a different issues, but there'll be unmade stuff. It's just kind of it's kind of looking at it, picking the thread you want, and in the sense of coherence for me, it was the logistics. It was the studio, but it can go project to project and not. But a lot of Hammer's issues are not unique. I think a lot of it is down to external factors outside of their control. Yeah.
Thanks, Kieran. Johnny, do you have another question for him?
I do have a question. I'm worried that it's too niche though. So, but I'll because we're talking about these, this big sort of overview of what's happening, and I'm going to try to pull focus a bit and focus on a particular example. So the whole Vampirella debacle fascinates me.
Yeah.
Because Vampirella, the comic, the comic book is in itself so self-reflexive, and it walks a line between contemporary, I don't know, the contemporary sex appeal of Vampirella, the character, and a self-reflexive indebtedness to earlier Gothic properties, such as Hammer films, for example.
Yeah.
So my question is, when you talk about the script, or one of the iterations of the Vampirella script, you make the point that there are many hat tips to sort of Hammer's earlier films. But I suppose my question is that the comic speaking rather than the script speaking?
That's a great question.
Yeah. Or, because it strikes me that, and I will shut up, but Vampirella owes a lot to Hammer in many ways, as do many comics of that period. So yeah, I mean, could you talk a little bit about that, maybe?
Yes. No, when you said niche, I was going to pretend I had connectivity issues, but I can actually answer that one fairly okay. He says before answering it. So yeah, I mean, there is this self-reflexiveness. I mean, when we did the Vampirella project, which we did a live script reading of it at Regent Street Cinema in London. When I say we, that was Kathy at De Montfort and Jenny Voss, John Rigby and Caroline Munro. All kind of pulled that together with me.
The dream team.
Yeah, that makes we solve crimes now, just on the side. We're a small detective agency. But basically, we looked at the script, and I was working with a really great a guy done like he was really like a software engineer called Adam, and he helped me build. He just graduated, and he'd done kind of creative. What's the word I'm looking for? Creative IT. And he helped me. We scanned the comic book because I was like, we knew which characters were in the script. So I was like, I bought like big thing of comics. I was like, I want to flip through and see if I can find like characters. So like I can put the person playing that character, and it was like we made an intro of it, which is so I can say it because I didn't have anything to do with it except dictating it. It's great. He did a really great job. And I realized by doing that the script by Wicking is incredibly faithful to the comics issues. It feels like it's like I mean, it's nonsensical as a feature film because it is like, here is one issue of the comic, next scene they're at a different place, hey, and then like, you have like Pendragon like, oh yeah, these are my undead friends who run this casino, and you're like, oh Jesus. And it's because he's obviously just absorbed all the comic books and done it. So 100% Wicking is writing it as a full adaptation. There is so much characters, narratives, dialogue from the comics, to the point where in the screenplay he has the comics like splash pages. He uses some splash pages on the script pages, which maybe is in the book, maybe not. But so it's 100% that. But I think, for example, things like Dracula's signet ring, no Raquel Welch and things like that. That kind of thing, I think, is the hat tip to Hammer. So as much as obviously, because Vampirella is a really interesting comic book, she hosts her own comic. She's breaking the fourth wall. And it is a comic that is, as you say, self-reflexive and remixing complete, previous iterations. But I think some of the iconography mentioned is pretty Hammer specific and isn't necessarily comic book specific. So there is, I think it's both is the short answer, is, and kind of absolute weasel answer, but like he's adapting directly issues of the comic for sure, from cover to cover.
That's amazing. That and in fact, like and you do make the point in the book, by the way, about the comic panels sort of appearing. That's what the Warriors, another new Hollywood film. That's what that was supposed to do.
Mm.
And then, of course, they did the horrible director's cut of that a few years ago, where they instated all that
Just
comic
put it
book
all
stuff.
in.
Just completely ruined the film in the process. But no, thank you for that, Kieran. I appreciate it very much.
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, there's never going to be it's a messy one, but I think absolutely it's hard to say, oh no, he was more concerned with Hamlet because of how faithful they are to the point where it completely compromises the script's structural integrity as an adaptation. So yeah, cheers, Johnny. Okay.
Thank you, Johnny. Thank you, Kieran. So we're reaching the stage in the session now where I'd like to invite attendees to start thinking about any questions that they want to pose to Kieran about his work. So please feel free to go ahead and start pasting them into the chat when you're ready, or otherwise indicate if you would like to ask your question yourself. But I know that if you still need a minute to think, that there are still things that members of the roundtable are keen to ask Kieran about. If anybody is ready now, please do go ahead and let us know. Otherwise, I'll go ahead and take chair's privilege and ask my last question. Is anyone ready?
Can't see anything.
Okay, in that case, I'll give folks a chance to. Oh, Kevin is ready. Over to you, Kevin, please. Kevin has pasted their question in the chat, and so I'll go ahead and read it out unless Kevin indicates otherwise. Kieran, you mentioned the Frankenstein TV series. Have you included any of their other TV projects, because they did some wild ones from what Kevin knows?
No, so the focus is mainly on the films. I think Tales of Frankenstein is an interest. I included it for, again, that kind of question that Mel asked, and that is completely like the BFI. And if anyone goes to the BFI special library, has some amazing stuff on it, on Tales of Frankenstein, from kind of production Bibles to meetings. So it featured because of that. It also featured because it was at that crossroads. There wasn't much TV stuff in the archive itself. We actually had the late Tim Beddoes from Network came and had a look in terms of the Unmade stuff. So we did, me and Steve Chibnall did a bit of a kind of recce on what they had, and we had some interesting Unmade like episodes of, you know, Hammer House of Horror. We had a John Peacock wanted to do a Moulin Rouge show, and there was a couple of episodes of that, but we could never figure out if that was for Hammer or it ended up in the archive when he worked at Hammer later on. But primarily film stuff. The book is film stuff, except for Tales of Frankenstein, for sure. But there is some, as you say, wild ones. And, you know, I mean, the thing in the archive, and I don't know if this would have been TV or film, I think it's a film. There's an extensive file on a Sooty movie called The Great Train Robbery. And I don't know, it wasn't obviously going to be Hammer. It must have been like Roy Skeggs, who had his own production company. But there is a, like, you know, I don't want to cause a rush, but there is just a whole file on Sooty sat in the archive that someone could break down and do like a 9-year project on. So, like, you know, there's stuff absolutely that it just doesn't quite fit in with the book, because the book, you know, again, in that kind of thing of narrative, there is a narrative to, you know, the focus is on Carreras and the kind of creative projects he was pointing out. So there is some examples in the archive, kind of cool TV stuff that I could, you know, could absolutely be burrowed into a bit further, but they don't feature extensively in the book, for sure. Yeah, sorry, Karen.
Cheers, Kieran. Next up, we have some remarks and a question from Kate. Thank you for that, Kate. Kate writes, thanks for a fascinating discussion, everyone, and congratulations, Kieran. Can't wait to read the book. I've got a messy methodology question.
Yes.
Kieran, you mentioned that you drew on material from the BBFC archive and that it was particularly useful for exploring unmade projects in Hammer's early period. What kinds of documents from the BBFC archive proved to be particularly useful, and how did it supplement what you found on this period in the DMU archive?
Yeah, so what was really useful in the BBFC was so it was kind of in conjunction with the Herrick trip. So they had in their Last Man on Earth file. I mean, the people, can I just say, like the archive, like, you know, in terms of like framing this book as, oh, it's like, you know, new material on Hammer. Like it's all that, like the archivists who have kept all of this material stored, easy to find, protected and safe, are just incredible. And it's not a new discovery or anything. It's been looked after and kept safe by amazing librarians and archivists who have been obviously done such a fantastic job at Hammer, at the Herrick, at BBFC, at the BFI, beyond. And I'm just, you know, reaping a lot of the benefits of them looking after this material so well by being able to dive into it. And the BBFC was so helpful because I basically said, do you have anything on night creatures? And this extremely helpful person there basically was like, yeah, there's actually a reference to night creatures in the Last Man on Earth file. So the Last Man on Earth, a made adaptation of I Am Legend, had some stuff in it from the night creatures. And so I went there and I saw it, and they had all this material on the night creatures and basically how they were never going to make it in a million years. And that all was in the Last Man on Earth file. So it wasn't, you know, it's fact, you know, it was down to this archivist having that kind of knowledge and knowing where to look and helping me with that. I found that. But in terms of a narrative in the book, I then went to the Herrick and found some night creatures stuff. And the MPAA, the American censor, had a very different opinion. So BBFC were like, and I'm paraphrasing, but BBFC were like, we're not going to let you make this because of all the murder and the horrible stuff. And the MPAA said, we're not going to let you make this because you say damn quite a few times. And the BBFC, like, there's a bit where one of the BBFC people just like, what is going on? Like, what's happening? Like, why are they saying to let them make this if they just took out a few Jesuses? The curse word, not the character. So, like, they completely are just, like, separate. So that's where the narrative came in, because the BBFC had all this useful material on the night creatures, but all it was telling me was this film didn't get made because of censorship, which was kind of known. But what the MPAA file showed me was actually there's this tension happening between what material is useful and able to, and how Hammer tried to play that off. And the MPAA file also made it clear that night creatures went on for a few more years. It was kind of commonly thought that project came and went within a few months. You know, script was written, sent it to BBFC. BBFC told them to bugger off, project was dead. But you can see they're trying to revive it quite a few times because of the MPAA file. So the brilliant people at BBFC kind of allowed me to look at the file specifically in the correspondence, and then the MPAA file at Herrick allowed me to kind of cross-reference that. So that was how helpful it was.
Thanks, Kieran. Next up, Smokey writes, you've mentioned the movies that didn't get made. Anything about the lost films, like Who Killed Van Loon or the Bank Messenger mystery?
No, so that's a good question. And it's back to messy methodology. I focused on the Unmade stuff. I mean, the lost stuff, I don't think... Oh, hold on. Steve's here. I don't think the archive has material on either of those two lost films. No, it doesn't. Because if I close my eyes, I can still see the spreadsheet of Unmade material. So I know it doesn't have those names. Don't ring a bell. But the lost films, I didn't look at in particular. It was mainly the Unmade ones, and that my methodological interest has changed. Like with the Shadow Cinema book that we did, like Hannah contributed to. I did with James Fennick, and another book with me and Fennick are doing called Studying the Unmade. We are trying to expand that thing to look at, you know, lost films or partially completed films, abandoned films, and thinking of that in terms of the kind of shadow history. But for this book, for neatness's sake, kind of just to keep my head straight, at least on one methodological principle, it's entirely focused on unmade films where no footage is shot. But I haven't actually heard anything on those projects in terms of archival material. They're not ones I've looked into, to be honest, Smokey. So any info you have or leads, I'd be fascinated to hear, because I'm completely blank on that. But thank you for the question. Okay, so I saw you already spotted Steve's contribution about that. So next question is from Marty. Of all these projects, which, if any, came closest to having an actual start date booked for cameras to start rolling? The famous ones do sound hopelessly
mired well short of that stage. Which of the projects, if any, came closest to having an actual start date?
So which of the projects came closest to starting? Vampirella came really close. Like I said, when you're pricing the stationery, I reckon you're pretty close. I mean, again, that one you can tell. Like they've got hotels booked and they're ready to go on that one. That's definitely the one that's like closest by a country mile. I think Nessie. It's unbelievable how close Nessie comes because that seems like such a long shot. And if like one person says, "Oh yeah, we'll give you that," like at one point, if Columbia said it yes, at one point they might have actually got it made, which is bananas. But I think the primary one is Vampirella because it gets stuck. These films get stuck in this weird cycle. Vlad the Impaler just never gets past that announcement stage. Like there's a script, there's an announcement, there's rumored directors, rumored casting, but it never gets past it. Whereas Vampirella, there's tangible archival evidence that it was pretty close, like very close. But that's kind of the only one, actually.
The only one.
That's close. That's like, it's a clear front runner, I think. I'm sure other people could correct me, but I think that's certainly the one in the book that is like, I reckon, close to going.
Thank you, Kieran, and thank you for your question. Marty, the next question is from Gavin. In Pete Townshend's biography, he mentions Hammer being briefly involved in the film of Tommy in 1975, but does not mention any reason why they ceased involvement when the Robert Stigwood organisation came in with financing. Kieran, did you come across any information on this project or why Hammer pulled out?
No, I have no idea. I didn't know they were involved in the project, Gavin. So that's honestly news to me. I mean, at the time, I would say financial precarity at that point. That's a really rough period. That's the Vampirella period where Michael Perez is getting the bus to meetings, as he says in one of his things. So I'd say it was. I mean, Hammer at that point were like 3-4 people. And I know in 1975 he spent a lot of time in Germany and the US, so it might have been personnel strains, it might have been financial strains, but I mean, as a company who could just come in with finance, I don't think they would be in that position. So I would complete speculation. It's probably something to do with that, but I don't know. I didn't know they were involved in it, Gavin. Sorry, but yeah, they were not in a good place in 75 for sure.
Thank you, Kieran, and thank you, Gavin, for your question. Anyone else have a question for Kieran? If not, or if folks need a little longer to think, actually one has just come in from Marty, but I might briefly return to the members of the roundtable after Marty's question, unless more questions come in. But for now, Marty asks, am I right in thinking Ken Russell turned them down flat on Vlad the Impaler? I've heard the radio play that was the basis, Lord Dracula by Brian Hales. Did script development stay close to this? And I know that Kieran will have a lot to say about this.
I do have a lot to say about this. I'm trying to find a quote, which is the first time I've opened this bastard book since I've got it. So I hope I don't find an argument. Okay, here we go. Yeah, so Russell writes a note to Michael Carreras, and he says in the note, so Carreras asked him to do it, and he says, the bloodbath at the end, this is Russell critiquing the script, the bloodbath at the end is as unnecessary as it is obnoxious. Blood, particularly movie blood, is not synonymous with horror. And then Russell ends it by saying, please don't misunderstand me, I would like to make a horror film with you, but a real one. So it's a no from Ken. Certainly not a maybe. He says no. And the script it's a self adaptation. So Brian Hales, who wrote Lord Dracula, does the script, the original script. It's very faithful, extraordinarily faithful to the radio play, to the point of being too talky because it reads like a radio play. It's an extraordinarily faithful adaptation. A couple of changes Unmade. So the radio play ends in a double execution by the priest Benedek and Dracula's son Istvan get killed. The screenplay changes that. Istvan survives, and the monk still loses his head. But the changes are minimal. And some changes, there's tweaks and changes. But one of the kind of key points of that chapter that looks at Vlad the Impaler is how, because that project is on the books until 2000. So 1974 to 2000, nearly 30 years. It barely changes. It barely changes from that adaptation of the radio play. It is remarkable how little. So Ken Russell did turn him down flat. Flat as a pancake. Like he's not having it at all. Does not like it. I think the fact they approached him is kind of helped shore up my argument that Michael Kerr was at least thinking a bit outside the box. He probably regretted it, getting that letter back. But the script itself is a very, very faithful self-adaptation of the radio play that barely changes in 26 years now. It's kind of, and multiple writers have a crack at it. John Peacock, chap called Jonas McCord, at least 3 or 4 writers have a run at it, and the script barely changes from that radio play. Yeah.
Extraordinary. Thank you for that fulsome answer, Kieran. The next question is from Laura. She'd love to know if there was a particular case study that you happened across while researching that you really wish had actually been made. What a question.
It's a good question. In terms of actual Hammer history, Night Creatures, because that's just right at that point where it would just maybe fuck up everything. It'd be really fascinating. Like a full Back to the Future, we've changed the timeline, we must go back kind of thing. In terms of probably like DVD player, like me wanting to watch constantly, like probably Nessie, that, a Jawsploitation movie sounds, the fact that they were like, it's not enough that a Loch Ness monster wakes up, she has to be radioactive. Like this mythical creature that is only limited by the scope of their own imagination, they still make radioactive, kind of shows how bananas it was. So I think in terms of actual DVD rotation, probably Nessie, but I think in terms of, if I put on my researcher hat, Night Creatures, I think would have the biggest impact. I think Hammer are so malleable, so flexible. There's no production method or strategy. They're fresh off Curse of Frankenstein to the point where anything can happen. And if that gets made, even at the same time as Dracula, it would have been kind of fascinating. So Night Creatures with researcher hat on, Nessie with shit film lover hat on, probably. Two good hats.
I love that double-hatted answer.
Yes, two hats.
Very much like Johnny was in agreement with you on your choice of.
Yeah, good.
Obviously, I mean, everybody. It's like that question answers itself, in my opinion.
Right.
You've got to see Nessie. Everybody wants to see Nessie. Just the fact that the film is called Nessie as well.
It's
such a terrible name for a film.
Yeah, just Nessie to a mate.
Such a misfire. And if I may also say that the ad, the print ad that you reproduce in the book, like really does smack of those disaster movies like Earthquake and so that's another way, I guess, that Hammer's trying to sort of align itself with contemporary Hollywood, but it's called Nessie though. Which is just
I didn't find anything in the archive where anyone was like, this is a shit name, but it's not great.
I was just thinking exactly the same thing about that illustration that you included, Kieran, the cover art of the script of Nessie, where sure enough, exactly as Johnny points out, the word Nessie seems so tonally at odds with everything else about the aesthetic of that art.
A bit informal.
Okay, no more questions have come in from the floor. That being the case, I know that both Mel and Johnny, and at the risk of maybe going too global at this late stage in the evening, both Mel and Johnny wanted to ask you about some of the methodological and epistemological questions raised by focusing on unmade films. If you would still like to ask Kieran about that, folks, over to you.
You're up, Mel.
Can I put in a quick word for Zeppelins versus Pterodactyls?
Pterodactyls,
Surely
yeah.
that's the film that we really wanted to see.
Yeah. Do you know there's actually aliens in that as well? They didn't even put that in the title, but there's actually little aliens in that. Yeah.
But to get back onto me epistemological bullshit, yeah, just that kind of, I think the methodological questions raised by what you're bringing to kind of film studies and film history by focusing not on the films that are made, but on the films that aren't made. And I suppose I'd be interested to sort of hear what you think are the bigger implications of unmade films as a kind of focus.
Yeah, so I think there's kind of different elements of it. I think there's like amazing work in terms of like writing structural wrongs in terms of unmade films. So like, there's structural racism and sexism built into the film industry and has been since its inception, basically. And really great work by people like Shelley Cobb, for example, who's done an amazing blog post on kind of unmade work and women directors, because you will see there's these huge gaps in women directors' filmographies, right? And it's kind of standard practice. Like, yeah, there's these big gaps. Someone like Patty Jenkins, a really contemporary, kind of popular filmmaker, Wonder Woman, but before that she made Monster, which got an Oscar, and then just does not make another film for several years in the kind of industry and environment where people like Colin Trevorrow are making one indie film and getting the Jurassic Park franchise, right? So it's the same parallels in industry. And what Shelley's saying is that the only way that you can actually get a good understanding of how these female directors are working in Hollywood and the actual burdensome difficulties that are going into it is by looking at their unmade stuff, because they're trying to get projects made and they're not going through. They're not getting made. So that's one really important way, and that's the same with race as well. Winnie Stubbs has a really good bit on James Baldwin's Malcolm X movie that never got made, and that it's the same, not the same, but that institutional kind of headwind that female directors face is the same thing that directors of colour face as well. And unmade films is a really good way of looking at some of that work and figuring it out. Thank you, Hannah. Yeah, that's the blog post. So that's one really important thing that these do, a kind of correction and an examination. But in something like Hammer, they create a more like, so the book is arguing, and Jonathan Rigby picked up this in the foreword, it's arguing for its own extinction, which is not something I did consciously. Maybe at the end of the PhD I was wanting extinction, but like at the time it didn't feel that. But it's arguing that there shouldn't be a book on Hammer produced films and then my book on their unmade films. That shouldn't be. It should be one book. Like if like the money and the to go back to that phrase, creative and economic labor that's going into these things are part of the history, right? So like it should be in there. There should be, oh yeah, they made Legends of the Seven Golden Vampires and that led to Carly. It shouldn't be, here's Legends of the Seven Golden Vampires and then Dracula franchise died and that was the last produced Dracula film. It should be included in there. So me and James Fennick at Shepard Hallam, we've done two edited collections, one the Shadow Cinema one, and we've got one called Studying the Unmade. And basically, Shadow Cinema was mapping the field. So here's loads of cool ways that unmade films can be engaged with and cool case studies. And then Studying Unmade is like, how could like the methodological approaches, like how can this be actually looked at as how can it be taught, but how can we learn from these and what are the questions that are asked from these films? And that's why we expand the scope to it. So like I have a chapter in that one about Batgirl, like a cancelled film that is made but cancelled, and what implications. I mean, they've just tried to do it again with the Looney Tunes Acme film. Warner Brothers cancelled that, and that's a produced film. They made it, but what happens? How do we actually study these things? Is really interesting to me as well. So there's loads of interesting ways. I think again, in my case, it would be about incorporating them just into production histories as important things. But sometimes they need to be isolated to understand, the careers of directors who, usually through structural institutional sexism and racism, are not given opportunities and are not getting projects produced, but are doing incredible amounts of creative labor. So multiple angles, and multiple great people have contributed to both books to kind of make sense of it. But it kind of depends on what you're doing. For mine, I'm arguing that it should just be like in these studies of these companies as a starting point. But there is, again, there's value in having them separate and actually drawing attention to them, particularly at the moment. Yeah, that makes sense. Oh, is Hannah muted? Are you muted? Or have I lost all perception of time and space and reality?
I'm so sorry.
Okay,
I was
good.
muted. I was just saying thank you for your response. And there is one more question come in from the floor, from Dave. If you could get one of the Unmade productions made today, is there one or more that you would like to see brought to the screen? So
actually today,
got to be Nessie, hasn't it? Got to be Nessie.
Johnny's in there. Maybe. I mean, today. I mean, yeah. There's a monster Godzilla TV show on Apple. Godzilla v Kong's out next year. Maybe we should all just chip in a few quick. Shall we try and pitch Nessie again?
The thing is, though, Nessie is something that a company like the Asylum would have made like 10 years ago.
Yeah. No, you're right. I mean, have they? I don't know.
There's a Moby Dick, so maybe there is a Nessie. I don't know.
Yeah. Can we get? Yeah, we'll workshop the title. But I think like Vlad the Impaler to me is the one that reads more like a contemporary script, to the point where Dracula Untold in 2014, the kind of Dracula origin story with Luke Evans, which is kind of, it's told through like a superhero lens of like, it's an origin story. He's just your regular warlord who sees who meets a creepy dude in a cave and he gets some powers. But that Dracula Untold, and even in fact, mainly the first 10 minutes of the Coppola Dracula, you can see how Vlad the Impaler would work as an origin. Like that first 10 minutes of Coppola's Dracula, where Gary Oldman's in that awesome red suit that's just screaming bloody hell. Absolutely is one of the reasons Vlad the Impaler, they go, oh, we'll try and make that again. So Vlad and Dracula Untold, as I say, kind of shows that origin story would have been viable. So probably contemporarily, that would be a safe bet. But yeah, no, still, yeah, Nessie for sure. Radioactive Nessie.
Cheers, Kieran. Yes, there are some people on this call who know that I am obsessed with Dracula Untold, but not for the reasons Kieran just listed, but rather because it is in fact a post-feminist fatherhood film.
Okay.
That, my friends, is a tale for another day. But we've ticked over into 8:25 now, so perhaps this is a good time at which to welcome Shelley and Laura back to the call to close the book on our evening. But before I hand back to them, I should have done this at the beginning. I just want to thank the other members of the roundtable by way of a plug for Mel's latest book, the BFI classic on A Taste of Honey, Johnny's latest book, Rewind, Replay, and thank you both for joining us on this panel, and congratulations, Kieran, on a truly wonderful achievement. I'm so happy for you that your all your hard work on Unmade Hammer has come to fruition in the form of this book. Thank you all for being here this evening, and I'll hand back to Laura and Shelley now.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody. Thank you, Hannah, for amazing sharing, and thank you to Mel and to Johnny and to Kieran, especially, and congratulations on the book. Really great chat. So thanks very much, everybody, and thank you for coming out tonight. We've got 2 events coming up, which we'll be posting information about in the next few days. So our next event on December the 13th is Doing Women's Global Horror Film History, which is quite a mouthful. We've started like using an acronym, but I didn't think anybody would understand that. So there we go. So that's December 13th, and we'll open registration for that in the next few days. And then on January the 13th, which is a Saturday, we have a symposium, Dead Media, Contemporary Horror and the Analog, that Shelley and I are running. And we'll be releasing the programme for that and information about registration in the coming days as well. So keep your eyes peeled on our Twitter and on our website. And also the recording from tonight will be up within a few days. If you want to revisit, or if you know anybody who missed it, feel free to pass the link on. So that's it. Thanks very much, everybody. Great to see you, and see you again soon. Thanks
Thanks, everyone.